Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar was imprisoned in Israel more than a decade ago and got an inside look on Israel's psyche during that time. According to the Washington Post, Sinwar said that what Israel considers its strength, the fact that most Israelis serve in the army and soldiers hold a special status in society, it's actually a weakness that can be exploited.
And according to recent New York Times reporting, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had for years been encouraging payments the Qatari government had been sending to the Gaza Strip. Big question is, did Israel want those payments to continue? Netanyahu's critics now disparaging these payments as part of a strategy of, quote, buying time. The policy is in the middle of discussions following Hamas's October 7th attack on Israel. Joining us now to discuss is senior correspondent at Vox, Zack Beauchamp. Welcome, Zack.
Hey, good to see you all again, even if, again, we're discussing maybe the most depressing topic on earth.
Very depressing topic indeed. Tell us more about these payments that it sounds like Netanyahu continued to be in support of. Tell us about what this money is ostensibly being used for and why, from the Netanyahu perspective, it was a good idea.
Look, so the basic idea behind these payments, right, facilitated via Qatar, sometimes very directly with Israeli support, was to prop up the Hamas government. Netanyahu has said as much, not in public, right? He doesn't openly admit this. He, in fact, denies it. But in reports of comments that he's made privately, that the basic idea here was you need to keep the Palestinians divided, right, between the Palestinian Authority, which governs the West Bank, and Hamas, which has governed Gaza since 2007. Now, why do you do that? In his mind, it's very simple, because Hamas is, or it was thought to be prior to October 7th, more responsible than other Palestinian militant factions in Gaza. And second, and more importantly, because when the Palestinians are divided, there's very little pressure on Israel to make any kind of final two-state agreement because there's no one to agree with, right? There's no unified Palestinian political structure. And so from the hardline Israeli point of view, Netanyahu's point of view, this is perfect. This is ideal. We can keep doing whatever we want, and we don't have to worry about the pesky international community as long as there are these like violent fanatics in charge of Gaza. So it was sort of a win-win from his point of view prior to October 7th, which changed everything, right? Because it showed that this entire calculation that Israel could kind of buy a certain kind of quiet from Hamas by quietly supporting them on the security front just was wrong, just entirely wrong.
And can you speak to this other aspect that you bring up here? The Washington Post reporting about what Sinwar learned having been in prison in Israel for all of those years. How is it that so many Israelis serving as part of the mandatory service in the military is a vulnerability for the country?
Yeah, so the basic idea behind Sinwar, who's sort of the mirror image hardliner on the Palestinian side, right, is that you can take advantage of Israelis' sense of compassion and commitment to treating their soldiers well and of caring about what happens to the community as a whole in the sense of collective concern for Israeli citizens, including captured soldiers, right? The idea is that when he was released from prison, he was in prison for quite a long time, it was in exchange for a captured Israeli soldier named Gilad Shalit, where to get Shalit out, Israel freed something like 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, many of whom, like Sinwar, were there on life sentences. The offenses he was accused of committing, and he seems to have done, were pretty egregious, including the murder of about 11 Palestinians that we know of. And, he was released because Palestinian militants leveraged Israel's valuation of the lives of its soldiers against Israel to get out people that they could then use to conduct future operations against Israel. And Sinwar, having learned Hebrew, studying Israeli broadcasts, realized that he could take advantage of this strategy. And it appears that this was part of the tactical calculation before October 7th, was that you capture a lot of Israelis and you force Israel to give you some very valuable things by capturing them in exchange.
How does that square with what we know about kind of who's been released so far in these exchange programs? There's been reporting that Israel has captured as many or more Palestinians from the West Bank that they have released as part of the hostage exchange program. And also there's been a great deal of reporting about the nature of the people that Israel has released, who, unlike this gentleman that you're talking about here, Sinwar, seem to have been disproportionately children and women and people who have not been charged with crimes.
Yeah. So the basic logic here on the Hamas side and in terms of the people who they want released is not just to get out militants this time around, right? Though many of those people, when you say children, some of them are like 17 years old and are charged with significant offenses. So it sort of it gets a little complicated. The women too, in this case, right?
The question I'm asking is
so
that
it's
reporting has been overwhelming that the bulk of the people released have not actually been charged with anything. And many of them, 17-year-olds are children, but they're also people much younger than that, and women. And again, regardless if they're adults, if they're not charged with anything, that paints a very different picture than who Sinwar was, right? Someone who was charged with crimes that I think are, to your point, are not in dispute.
Yeah. Israel has this system called administrative detention that they use to hold Palestinians without charge. There are significant allegations of abuse in the system. Human rights groups have a lot of problems with it. It is part of the sort of really cruel system that Israel uses to control Palestinian lives and maintain the occupation of the West Bank. All of that is true. And a lot of what's happening and what Hamas is trying to do, it's like these aren't just, though they're unlikely to be just random people, though I'm sure there are cases of random Palestinians who were doing nothing. A lot of the time, there was some kind of provocation. There was a reason. There's some, oftentimes, allegations of violence that Israel just does not take into court for reasons that are specific to each individual case. And Hamas wants to leverage itself as the leader of the Palestinian national movement, right? So getting people free and getting them to meet their families, to return home, and to be able to credit Hamas for that release really boosts its popular image as the true defender of Palestinians against the Israeli occupation, which is ultimately, right, what they're going for. The real prize here, they don't think they're going to destroy Israel in this conflict. What they want is to seize the mantle of leadership of the Palestinian national movement from the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Liberation Organization and the Fatah party that controls both of them. That's what Hamas wants, and that's the point of many of these prisoner exchanges.
What kind of internal pressure is Netanyahu facing right now? Obviously, I've looked at the polls, and it seems that there's pretty overwhelming support in Israel for actions against Hamas in Gaza along the lines of exactly what Israel is doing. But is it support for the government and the state of Israel in its time of crisis, or is it specific support for Netanyahu and his policies, given that maybe even if you are a hardliner against Hamas, you might at this point be skeptical that Netanyahu's plan was good, or is there some kind of rallying around him going on?
There's zero rallying around Netanyahu. There's a poll just a few days ago that found 72% of Israelis want him to resign. The only real division between Israelis at this point is, do you want him to resign now or only resign after the war when we deal with those things? That's like sort of the principal view on the question of Netanyahu. His party's cratering in polls. Some of his political allies are also falling in polls significantly. This does not mean a real move to the left among Israelis. It's kind of a complicated picture, but what it does appear to be is kind of a return to the center. The leading party that is gaining support per polling right now is the sort of center-right National Unity faction, which is currently in the government on an emergency basis to help manage the war, but was the lead opposition party prior to the war, one of the leading opposition parties, I should say. And that faction is sort of the recipient of a sense or the beneficiary of a sense among Israelis that what we need right now is a kind of not crazy leadership, not ideological, not corrupt, that is willing to pursue this war that there's really strong support for, at least among Jewish Israelis. And the support for the war, as far as I can tell, remains intense. However, there is significant criticism of the way it's being prosecuted, especially led by family members of hostages and those killed. And released hostages, right? This faction of Israeli society is saying, you're not prioritizing our lives in the way that we thought you would, in the way that actually Sinwar's theory suggests that they would, right? Is that you're prioritizing the demolition of Hamas and the destruction of a lot of things in Gaza over a serious effort to get the remaining 150-odd hostages out of Gaza. And this line of criticism, more so than a sort of more direct or blunt anti-war criticism, has really stung Netanyahu and is becoming a serious locus of criticism of the way the government is organizing the war policy. So if that's where real pressure for a more permanent ceasefire is to emerge, it's going to come from there.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to hear some of the hostages that have been released talk about fear that they were going to be killed by IDF bombs while they were being held hostage by Hamas. You have obviously 18 1,000 people who have now died in Gaza, but with what is it, 80% of all housing that's been destroyed, you can get a picture of how are hostages ever going to be able to be safe in Gaza given the level of destruction? And then, of course, you had last week the United States vetoing a deal to release all hostages in exchange for a permanent ceasefire. And how can you keep, I mean, I think this is an interesting question, how can you keep saying that your priority is releasing hostages when you have the U.S. vetoing said bill ostensibly on behalf of Israel, doesn't have that veto power, saying, no, we don't want all the hostages returned in exchange for a veto. I mean, do you have any sense of how that particular UN action or lack thereof translated in Israel?
Yeah, I mean, the UN resolution was toothless, like most UN resolutions, right? It was just a sort of aspirational call for an end to the conflict and the release of hostages.
Well,
So
it was toothless because it was vetoed,
it wasn't
right?
really meaningful. Yeah, but even if it had passed, it would not do anything. It would not change anything. It was just kind of like a lot of things in the UN, a diplomatic means of staking out a position of this conflict, one that was critical of the Israeli position.
But if it means nothing, then why veto it, right? You can't kind of have it both ways. If it's meaningless, then Israel doesn't have to comply, then you don't have to veto it. And if Israel feels pressured to comply because it passes. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of how it would have affected Israeli conduct of the war, right? The reason that the U.S. vetoed it is because it could have created the potential for the use of international law as a means of condemning Israeli behavior, which is something both Israel and the United States oppose, right? It's not just the resolution passes and then hostages are released. I think if that were the case, there would have been a very significant view of it, or a very significantly different view of it among the Israeli public. As of right now, it was perceived among Israelis, like a lot of things, and not without justification, that happened at the UN as being a sort of one-sided, if not one-sided, but certainly disproportionate condemnation of their behavior. And so the Israelis and their American allies were just like, we're not going to let this resolution through. We want the conflict to be resolved through a combination of battlefield victories and resolutions amenable to the sides involved, Israelis and Palestinians specifically, not one to be dictated through the kind of use of international law as a cudgel. Again, I'm not endorsing this view. I'm explaining where it's coming from in Israeli society and why the U.S. did what it did. It wasn't just a sort of rejection of the idea of freeing hostages in general.
Zack Beauchamp, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.